Thank you all for joining us. Good afternoon, and welcome to the third installment of Preservation Connecticut's Spring 2024 series, talking about preservation. My name's Stacey Vero, and I'll be your host today. I'm standing in for our Executive Director, Jane Montanaro. And today we're going to be chatting with Dr. Daryn Reyman-Lock, who's the curator at the Barnum Museum. And she's also a lifetime Connecticut resident. She graduated from Lehigh University with a dual degree in geology and archaeology and completed her master's and PhD studies at the University of Nottingham in England. In addition to her work at the Barnum, Dr. Reyman-Lock works as a historic preservation specialist, and she's worked closely with nonprofits and municipalities to curate exhibits, catalog and move museum collections, and research historic landscapes and buildings. But before we get to Daryn, today I'd like to share a little bit about our organization. Preservation Connecticut is the statewide private nonprofit. We were founded in 1975 by a special act of the Connecticut General Assembly as the Connecticut Trust for Historic Preservation, with a goal to preserve, protect, and promote the buildings, sites, and landscapes that contribute to the heritage and vitality of Connecticut's communities. We're statutory partners with the Connecticut State Historic Preservation Office, and we're proud to say that for 49 years, keep an eye out for our 50th anniversary next year. We're going to have a bunch of programming and fun activities. We have successfully championed the protection of remarkable community assets all over the state by leveraging funding, advocating, forming partnerships, and promoting stewardship. So our office is located in the Eli Whitney Boarding House on Whitney Avenue in Hamden. You can see it up there on the screen. It's listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and it's the only surviving residential structure of the industrial village that's centered on Eli Whitney's armory. It's served as our headquarters since 1989. We have a staff of 9 preservation professionals and a board of 21 preservationists from around the state. The staff listed here include Christopher Wiegren, Jane, of course, who's at the National Press Conference, our executive director, Christopher Wiegren, our deputy director. You can contact Chris for information on historic preservation easements, our bi-monthly magazine, Connecticut Preservation News, and to arrange book talks for his book, Connecticut Architecture, Stories of 100 Places. Renee Tribert, our Making Places and Preservation Services Manager. Contact Renee for information on redevelopment of historic industrial sites and tax credit applications. Jordan Sorensen is our Development and Special Projects Manager. Jordan manages our communication and outreach to members through social media and email, receives and monitors demolition notices from municipalities, and prepares historic tax credit applications and nominations to state and National Register of Historic Places. Kristen Hopewood is our Membership and Outreach Manager, and she manages all of the inquiries that come through our website. She provides member services, arranges special events, and is the editor of our Historic Properties Exchange, a free listing of threatened historic properties. And finally, our team of circuit riders, Field Director Mike Farino, Brad Scheid, me, and Stefan Danchik. We provide assistance to homeowners, developers, municipal leaders, nonprofit organizations, museums, historic district commissions, and more, with an array of technical assistance, including community organizing, prioritizing maintenance and repairs, identifying funding sources and preservation professionals who can help get the job done, and we provide advice on historic designations and issues related to archaeological concerns. So as always, please contact any of us afterwards, after this talk or whenever, for a call or a site visit if you have a preservation issue that needs some assistance. So these lunchtime talks have become a great way to connect with the public and exchange ideas on a variety of preservation topics. If you have questions today, we ask that you use the chat feature. We've gotten some already, and we'll be reading those off at the end of the presentation. You can also raise your hand at the end of the presentation, and we'll get to you. We'll make sure we address all of your questions. If you are available on Saturday, we would love if you can join us at Lambert Corner in Wilton. We're going to be having the last installment of our series in person there, and we'll be joined by, it's at 11 o'clock, and we'll be joined by Nick Foster of the Wilton Historical Society as he discusses the adaptive reuse of several historic buildings on their campus. So if you can join us, we would absolutely love to see you there. But now I'm going to turn it over to Daryn And I'm going to stop sharing. Let's see.
All right.
Dr. Reyman-Lock, it's all yours.
All right, let's see if I can get my screen sharing to work. That's always going to be a fun thing. Huh? Can you see?
We can. Perfect.
Well, thank you so much, Stacy, for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone. Welcome to this talk. I'm Dr. Daryn Reyman-Lock, and as Stacy said, I'm the curator at the Barnum Museum. As advertised, I'm here to talk to you all about creepy things because it's October, and well, if anybody does creepy things, it's the Barnum Museum, and we have a bunch of them in our stacks and our collections. But before I get into the weeds of mermaids and mummies and all of that jazz, I figured I would start with our largest collection item, which is our building. We've actually given it an accession number, and we achieved national landmark status last year, actually November, so almost exactly a year ago. The museum building was financed by P.T. Barnum. It was designed by Lambert and Bunnell, who are architects from Bridgeport, and it's adorned with terracotta sculptures crafted by Belgian sculptor Henri Placher. It opened to the public in 1893 and was originally the home of 3 Bridgeport-based societies: the Fairfield County Historical Society, the Bridgeport Medical Society, and the Bridgeport Scientific Society. In 2010, many people know we were hit by a tornado, and since here at the Barnum, we embrace sensationalism, we thought with the tornado under our belt, we should collect the rest of the natural disaster set. So since then, we've had several hurricanes, a couple of floods, and at least 1 earthquake. I think the last natural disaster we have not yet been hit with is an attack by a 50-foot spider, but there is still time for that, I suppose. Regardless, Barnum Magic has kept this building standing for the last 132 years. And we're just about to finish the first phase of restoration work. The external restoration of the building is almost complete. I think we're going to complete it within the next week. All the scaffolding is down. But really interestingly, during this phase, as you can see in the lower left-hand corner, if you can see my cursor, we brought in 22 tons of structural steel to help stabilize the building, which sustained a lot of structural damage due to the tornado. This dome here was lifted, twisted, and slammed back down on the building. So now we're structurally stable. Regardless, we're forging on, and we recently launched a capital campaign to revitalize the interior and create a more fully immersive, visitor-centered experience for everyone. We're also talking about opening our gallery a few times a week very, very soon. So please watch for that announcement. We're very excited to welcome people back into this space. In terms of our mission, I've kind of pushed the instructive entertainment idea to a whole different level since I started here about 1.5 years ago. Our collections are, as you guys can probably imagine, a bit strange. We have the typical things that museums have, art, ceramics, documents, decorative arts, all of that stuff. But we also have a lot of other things. It's not just Barnum-centric materials. We have ancient materials. We have ethnographic collections. We have a centaur named Phil. And I guess technically we have 2 mermaids. Yes, 2, a real one and a fake one. And I guess I'll let you marinate on the phrasing of that and do with it what you will. But before I launch wholeheartedly into the weird and wonderful, faked and forged of our collection, I guess I should begin by saying that I'm an archaeologist by discipline, and my specialty is social theory and identity studies. So whether I'm looking at architecture or an object, I view them as sort of the same thing. They're physical remains of abstract human life, the thoughts, the desires, tastes, and a host of other things that make people people. As a result, whenever I look at architecture or an object, my first questions are, why did someone make this? What does it tell us about history? Who wanted it? and what was it for? So it's with those questions in mind that I'm presenting 4 wild and weird stories of our objects to you today. And since Barnum was known for his hoaxes and the Prince of Humbugs, I'm going to start there. So until February of this year, we had one mermaid in our collection. It was a reconstruction of the one Barnum owned that was actually destroyed in a fire. And while ours is very much a 3D replica, I've put a drawing up on the screen for you to kind of understand what this thing looks like. And it sits across from my office, so it stares at me daily. We welcomed a new mermaid, though, to our collection, and she is named Dobby the House Mermaid, or we just call her Dobbs for short. And here she is in all of her wonderful, glorious splendor. So when this first came into our collection about 9 months ago, my first reaction was kind of like, well, how do I tell my parents what I'm now doing with my PhD? I'm running a mermorgue and taking care of mermaid carcasses. But as that initial reaction started to subside, I started looking at Dobbs and thinking, why? Why did someone create this? What is the background here? What's actually being told to us about this society of the 19th century? And truthfully, when I started researching the historic background of mermaids as both mythological and physical creatures, it all kind of started making sense. It all came together. I think that mermaids as a physical thing, an idea, are familiar to most people. People generally know or have some understanding of what they are. They're divine or semi-divine creatures that have been present in the ideology of numerous cultures going back to at least 2500 BC. And lore wasn't just restricted to Europe and Asia Minor. We get it throughout the world. Water spirits and mermaid-style gods are found the world over, from Africa, where we get Mami Wata, to Japan, where we get the Nyai Dull, and even in Iran, we get depictions of mermaid-style gods and goddesses. All of them, however, are linked with ideas of fertility, reproduction, and prosperity. So then the question becomes, well, how do we go from this like benevolent fertility goddess to morally ambiguous, somewhat sinister creature? Historically, we can actually trace that change to the 3rd century BC, when an epic called The Voyage of the Argos was written. In this epic, the Argos's crew gets off their ship, and a boy named Hylas is abducted by a mermaid. That in and of itself might be one of the earliest examples, but it's by no means the only. It's not an isolated story. Tales like this are found throughout Europe and Asia and throughout history. You know, in Germany, we get Lorelei of the Rhine. In England, in the 7th century AD, we start getting benches in Cornwall that are carved with mermaids and mermen. And in the Slavic lands like Russia,
unless we did sweet and sour meatball,
who live in various water bodies. Through these stories, we start to get a glimpse of the main personality traits of mermaids. They can certainly be kind, but their gifts often come with later misfortune. They're easily offended, which results in water-based problems like floods. And seeing them on a voyage is generally an omen of storms, untamed seas, disaster, and shipwrecks. So what is the takeaway here? What can we learn from these stories? These stories tell us that mermaids are actually a metaphor. They're a metaphor for the dualistic nature of the sea. It's a fascinating thing. It's a source of life, but at the same time can be violent, untamable, changeable, dangerous, and enigmatic. So that's great, but how does that get us to where we need to be with regard to the physical remains of mermaids? Why do we care about this history? How does it apply to collections objects? And I'm so glad that you're all on mute, because I'm sure you're all asking that very question. The fascination with mermaids really increased as world exploration opened new frontiers and resulted in trade with China, Japan, and Indonesia, places that are very much considered exotic to the Western world at these periods in time. During the 19th century, museums and private collections started to fill with objects from these exotic lands, these distant areas that now people were trading with. Mermaids were among these objects and were given the name Fiji mermaids very specifically to tap into a perceived exoticism. But the big spoiler alert here is that none of them have anything to do with Fiji at all. In truth, people probably wanted to believe in mermaids. Certainly, there are reports of sightings of mermaids throughout this period, but also their existence was kind of convenient, just in a scientific way. Carl Linnaeus at this time is a Swedish biologist and physician who was assembling a taxonomic tree and solidifying today what is binomial nomenclature, which is just a fancy term for naming living things, right? All the way down from life to genus and species. Linnaeus sort of felt the existence of mermaids was logical since it could link the animal kingdom to the human one. And in this way, mermaids were a type of missing link. And evolution sort of requires something to transmutate one thing to its successor. So while I should acknowledge that there were people that saw conflict in relating animals and humans and wanted to certainly stress the difference between those two groups, for many, it wasn't hard to make the jump from not believing to believing in their existence. And that's where Mr. Barnum comes in. Fiji mermaids were not new things in the 1800s. There were at least 5 exhibits of mermaids in London alone between 1775 and 1795. But Fiji mermaids really begin appearing in the 1800s as curiosities in both museums and in traveling shows. Many of the mermaids that begin to appear, including the one Barnum owns and displays at his American Museum, are thought to have been constructed in Japan out of fish and primates, although some are distinctly made out of wood completely. So why Japan? Well, Japanese folklore is replete with composite animals. Some of these composite animals are found in Shinto and Buddhist shrines during the 19th century and even earlier. Versions of these animals could be purchased at what are called mizumono. Mizumono were shows or exhibits that peddled novelty and curiosity, and they really represent the beginning of a more popular style of leisure culture that was really open to all strata of society. It wasn't just for the higher classes. But whatever the case with Mizumono, the popularity of the Fiji mermaid resulted in a small manufacturing business that lasted well into the late 19th century. Some scholars even believe that all the mermaids that were produced during the time were actually produced by the same artisan, one particular person. So let's talk about Barnum and Moses Kimball's mermaid. That mermaid was initially purchased by English sea captain Samuel Eads from a Japanese fisherman or sailor in 1822. That is 20 years before Barnum exhibits it at his American Museum. So the story goes, Eads actually sells the ship he captains to purchase this mermaid for an astronomical sum of money, 6,000 Spanish dollars. So there are multiple problems with this story. First of all, 6,000 Spanish dollars is a huge, huge amount of money at that time. But more to the point, he doesn't own the ship that he sells to buy this mermaid. So if there's a takeaway, don't sell your neighbor's car to buy a Fiji mermaid. I don't know what actually happened with the gentleman who owned the ship when he found out, but regardless, Eads' son eventually gets the mermaid, and he's the one who sells it to Moses Kimball, who at the time is the proprietor of the Boston Museum in 1842. Kimball shows it to Barnum. Barnum's super intrigued, loves the idea of it, begins to lease it and show it at his American Museum in New York City. So I think of all the hoaxes, this is the most famous of all of Barnum's. As I said, we also do have a centaur named Phil, which was not owned by Barnum, but I don't want to leave you, regardless, with the impression that our collection is just a bunch of hoaxes. So I'm going to transition and talk to you about a couple of our reels. All right, so I know I just put up 3 glass milk bottles, and some of you are probably like, oh, great, glass milk bottles. We've all seen those. But we just accessioned these 3 new milk bottles into our collection. And while many museums, I will acknowledge, have these in their racks, I think few go into great detail to identify how the bottle is made, as opposed just to writing up where it came from and how it's related to the locality in which it's. Okay, here we go. So I know many of us have heard stories of the milkman in all their forms and glories. Milk used to be delivered in cans, which were stacked upright in the back of a wagon. The wagon would stop for a delivery, and the customer would actually bring out a pitcher or pail to receive the amount of milk they actually wanted to buy. The milkman would literally ladle the exact amount that was going to be purchased into the pitcher or pail before moving on to the next delivery. While this kind of evokes a generalized image of Mayberry Americana, it actually promoted extraordinarily unhealthy and sometimes even hazardous conditions. During the early and mid 1800s, a large number of milk cows were infected with bovine tuberculosis. Milk from these cows could be contaminated, and the disease spread to people who drank the contaminated milk. Tuberculosis was not a short-lived problem by any stretch of the imagination, nor was it confined to just America. By the late 19th century, it's estimated that somewhere between 70 and 90% of urban populations in both Europe and America were actually infected with tuberculosis. And of those, 80% who developed active tuberculosis died from the disease. While not all infections were due to ingesting contaminated milk, people began investigating that as a cause for the spread of TB. Transmission via milk was still an issue even into the 1920s, so much so that the New York State Tuberculosis Association condemned the practice of milk delivery via cans as a major cause for its spread. It should be said that milk was also a source of other things, other bacteria that could cause other really terrible diseases like Q fever, diphtheria, strep infections, and typhoid. So then the question becomes, well, why don't we just pasteurize everything to ward against not only tuberculosis, but every other disease-causing bacteria that might be in the milk? French microbiologist Louis Pasteur invented the process of pasteurization in the early 1860s, but it wasn't until the late 1880s that anyone actually thought to apply the process to milk itself. Tainted milk by this point was suspected of causing almost 1 in 4 infant deaths in New York alone. By 1895, commercial pasteurizing machines specifically used for milk were introduced to the United States. It wasn't until 1909 that any American state actually implemented pasteurization. Chicago was the first one to do so, with New York following in 1914. Within 7 years of passing that law, infant mortality dropped 70% in New York City. In 1947, Michigan became the first city to require pasteurization of all milk sold within the state, with another 43 years passing before the FDA actually mandated pasteurization of both milk and milk products for human consumption. And for those who don't want to do that math, that takes us up to 1990, which is substantially later. Because of all this, people began looking for a better and a safer method of milk distribution. Glass milk bottles were better than cans, not only because they were more sanitary due to their non-porous, non-toxic, and impenetrable container, but also because it helped in delivery, preservation, and reuse. There was actually a recycling program for it. The earliest glass milk jars developed around 1868 and had a screw clamp that held the lid to the bottle. In 1883, Harvey D. Thatcher patented what is called the milk protector, which is the big bottle on the screen right now. This is an individual glass bottle that allowed milk to be delivered sealed. And as a result of this, he's sort of regarded as the father of the glass milk bottle. His company, Thatcher Manufacturing Company, became revolutionary in the field. They were the first to use automatic bottle machinery and held a number of patents. They also ended up producing over 50% of the glass milk bottles in the United States. Thatcher employed his brother-in-law, a guy named Harvey Barnhart, who in 1889, along with his brother Samuel Barnhart, patented what is called the common sense milk bottle, which instead of a glass closure like on the milk protector bottle, it had a ligneous disc that sat inside the mouth of the bottle on a small lip that held it in place. It was actually this bottle that became standard by 1900. Over the next few years, a number of different bottles were patented, including the Universal Store bottle, the Norman A. Henderson's cream top bottle, where that bulb on the top caught the cream as it rose and separated from the milk. The Pecora baby top bottle, which I personally find slightly more disturbing than Dobby the house mermaid, and Cop the cream bottle. There was so much variation that there was actually a push to standardize milk bottle cap sizes, cap seats, the roll of the finish, everything. But what was more interesting to me are the manufacturing techniques that went into creating the bottles themselves. And there are 3 different methods. The first is the mouth blown in mold technique, which is exactly what it sounds like. The process is supported by glass blowing, and you need a gaffer or a glass blower to actually blow the glass into the mold. The second method involves the earliest semi-automatic machines called press and blow machines, which involve a combination process. The third method is the fully automatic system. And that is the fully automatic machine right on the screen. The first of these machines was the Owens automatic bottle machine, which was patented in 1903. This machine is absolutely incredible. It's really an amazing feat of engineering because it resulted in reduced child labor in glass container plants in New York. But if we want to look bigger, in actuality, its development did more to decrease child labor in the early 20th century than any piece of legislation that had been passed up to that point in time. A year after the Owens automatic bottle machine was patented, the Thatcher Manufacturing Company, in all their revolutionizing glory, obtained a license for these and was the only glass house that was actually allowed to use it for milk bottle production. So going back to the 3 glass milk bottles that were just donated to us, all 3 have a heel mark that says MTC, indicating that they were produced by the Thatcher Manufacturing Company. They're all from local Bridgeport-based dairies. But interestingly, they are made by different techniques, which allows us to date them. So the Mitchell bottle on the left of your screen is 1905 to 1926. It has ghost seams, an ejection scar that has feathering on the bottom, and was made by the Owens automatic bottle making machine. The other 2, the Dewhurst and Beechmont bottles, were made between 1889 and 1934. They are a combination process by the semi-automatic machines. We can tell that by the seams on the side, the lip, the roll of the finish, the bottom ejection scar, and also the medallions, those circular medallions, particularly on the one in the middle, the Beechmont, were very specific to a time period. We also know that in 1934, the plant started putting the titles and names on the bottles in a different way. They used pyroglazing, which is different than what we actually have here. All right, so milk bottles are one example of the many manufactured items we have in our collection, but we have other manufactured things. Although there are different kinds of manufactured, they are forgeries. But since they are old and have some interesting histories themselves, I love what they represent, and they were probably my favorite thing to find among our shelves. So when I first got to the Barnum about a year and 4 months ago, the first thing I began to tackle was looking at ancient artifacts because my background is really Roman archaeology. And 2 of the things that I immediately stumbled on were these daggers. They are simply marked late Roman dagger or late Roman knife. And as soon as I looked at them and I thought, nope, these are not late Roman anything. The form and decoration certainly doesn't fit that time period. And to me, they have a much more medieval feel, but there's something off about them. This one on the left has a dragon head. And this one has an open diamond hilt and the date of 1021 on the pommel, which is very hard to see, but it's right here. It's right on the top. I'm assuming that's a date at least. And it also has an inscription that says Spurk, which is still something I'm still trying to figure out what that means. So the interesting part when I started really looking at these is that an exact match to our dragon head dagger was sold about 2 summers ago via auction, and it was attributed to Billy Smith and Charlie Eaton. So this is where I sort of got really intrigued, because Billy Smith and Charlie Eaton are sort of a little bit infamous in British archaeology, because they are known forgers, and their items are called the Shadwell Dock forgeries. So I'm going to tell you that story because it's the best thing since sliced bread in my world. In the mid-19th century, Billy and Charlie are living around what is now Royal Mint Street in London, making money as mudlarks. And if there's anybody out there that doesn't know what mudlarking is, it's an activity where you scrabble around in mud near rivers, attempting to find objects of interest or of value. Particularly good places are places like London, where you have a very long relationship between habitation and pollution and the Thames River, which is also tidal and constantly laying new amounts of mud. And it has an equally long history for things like shipping. Anyway, Billy and Charlie would mudlark and take their finds to an antique dealer named William Edwards. And William Edwards would purchase these things and sell them on. During their early years of mudlarking, they really only found monetary success with one particular item. It was a medieval item, and they got a decent amount of money from its sale. But within a few more years of that, by 1957, Billy and Charlie were kind of feeling a little bit lackluster about their takes from this mudlarking activity, because it is very strenuous. They weren't making the money that they had hoped to, but they did still see potential in that sort of job and career and in selling antique wares. So they started just, kind of rethinking their life choices, and they decided to pivot, and they thought they would do the next best thing to mudlark, which is make knockoffs. So they made molds and dies and started casting medallions, figurines, daggers, ampullae, and various other goods out of lead or lead alloy. Then they would take these items, they pop them into acid baths to make them look even older, but the techniques that they were using to really create these objects were so primitive that there was already sort of an implied age. They were thin, they had pot marks, they had poor edges, pits, uneven surfaces, the whole 9 yards. But the best part of this story, my favorite part of this story, is that all of them had inscriptions and dates on them. So just for reference, Arabic numerals like we use for our dates today weren't in use in Europe until the 1500s. And so when we get materials of Billy and Charlie's that are marked 1032, like this medallion here, or a dagger that's marked 1021, we automatically know they're forgeries because no such date would have existed at that time. They're inauthentic. And the better part about all this is that those inscriptions, Billy and Charlie were illiterate. So they were just making stuff up and putting it on daggers and medallions. So our Spurk dagger means absolutely nothing. It couldn't be real. The icing on the cake to all of this, though, is that no one, not a single person, amateur or expert or otherwise, clued into anything they were doing for a very long time. The items that Billy and Charlie were making were bought for good sums. They started making that money that they were hoping to cash in on during mudlarking. And old William Edwards, the antique dealer, kept selling their wares on, thinking that they were real and original as well. Billy and Charlie at this point started telling everyone that they found their antiques at Shadwell near the docks, which is why they are now referred to as the Shadwell Dock forgeries. Obviously, this little con couldn't last. The items started arousing suspicion. There were types of objects that were never before seen, and the secretary to the British Archaeological Association, a guy named Henry Sire Cumming, And an archaeologist who was kind of like a rock star at that time named Thomas Bateman began trying to actively expose Billy and Charlie and their little gig. They even got the British Museum involved, and by March 1858, Cumming had discovered how the objects were made, calling out the crude manufacture and the anachronisms in design. Word began to spread. Story was published in several periodicals of the time and even went to court. So if that wasn't enough, a guy named Charles Roach Smith, who was a pretty well-known archaeologist at the time, inspected Billy and Charlie's handiwork himself. He believed them to actually be 16th century in origin, and even went so far as to claim they couldn't be fake because, wait for it, no forger would create anything so absolutely ridiculous. In truth, he literally stated that if they were fake, they would be the, quote, most extraordinary insults that were ever offered to the judgments of collectors of this century. The debate on whether or not the items were authentic didn't end there, though. They continued for years, and it wasn't until 1861 that the fraud was finally exposed. Another man named Charles Reed began questioning the dock workers at Shadwell, and couldn't find anyone who either actually found the objects or saw Billy and Charlie. He even got a sewer hunter, and yes, that's an actual profession, to admit he was hawking the forgeries on behalf of Billy and Charlie. He also convinced this poor guy to break into Billy and Charlie's workshop to steal their molds as proof of forging. The molds and dies were then showed to the Society of Antiquaries. So what happened to Billy and Charlie after this? They escaped. They did not get prosecuted. They continued making fakes and forgeries and were in business making still decent sums of money until 1869. And at the end of the day, they probably faked over 10,000 items. So that's a big deal. Charlie ends up dying of tuberculosis in 1870 at 35 years old, probably because he drank infected milk, but that's another story. Billy disappears from the record completely in 1871. So returning to our daggers, these are two bona fide examples of the Shadwell dock forgeries, touch created and sold by Billy and Charlie themselves. While part of me does wish that we had more paperwork to really explain their provenance, where they came from, how they came to the museum, since I'm sure the path they took would have been interesting in and of itself. I kind of love the fact that these are fakes, because I think the story is better than if they were actual true daggers from the medieval period. Okay, so we have time for one more story, and I think there's no better way to end a lecture in October, the day before Halloween, than talking about mummies. During the late 19th century, there was a fascination with ancient Egypt that was aptly termed Egyptomania. Many museums and collectors wanted mummies for themselves, and from that desire, there arose this like very morbid practice of going and selecting your mummy, selecting your coffin, and putting the two together, even though they didn't necessarily go together. They would be packaged as an artificial pair and sent back home, where they would be unwrapped by various, scientific societies of the time. And once they found, the bead net necklaces or the ushabtis or any lapis lazuli, the body was very often thrown away. So around the same time, and newspaper articles, I should say, as I put up on the screen, talk about this subsequent unwrapping of mummies. And it's actually in this process that we got our mummy into our collection in 1894. She was purchased or given to Barnum's widow, Nancy Fish, and brought back to the Institute, where she was subsequently unwrapped, but they did not throw her out. They kept her. Our mummy was recently the subject of a multi-year interdisciplinary and international research project to examine her remains and the coffin to restore her identity and humanity. Like so many mummies, she had been kind of just viewed as an object rather as a human. particularly during the late 19th and early 20th century. And it was very much time to change that narrative and kind of restore her humanity a bit. As part of our project, we did a facial reconstruction, which I will show you in a minute. The project, through all the different experts we spoke to, we were able to find out that the coffin was actually belonged to a 60-year-old Stoic priest named Pa Eve. And that for a very long time was the mummy's narrative because we thought they went together. But through this project, we found out she's actually a 35-year-old woman who likely died of periodontal disease almost 2,500 years before the coffin was ever manufactured. She had something like 17 abscesses in her mouth, and her teeth are very, very ground down. So she must have been in extraordinary pain by the time she died. With the help of our experts, we have renamed her Ippy, so she is no longer referred to as just the mummy, and this is what she would have looked like. So let's usher in the most Halloweeny part of this talk. I'd love to say that trafficking mummies was a 19th and 20th century invention, but it actually started much, much earlier in the medieval period, and actually started to name mummies mummies. It's why mummies are called mummies. The story is slightly tangential because Ippy didn't go through this process, but was one of the lucky ones, I suppose. But it is a lesser known history of Egyptian mummies. During the medieval period, there was a drug called mumia, which was produced by pulverizing mummified bodies. Mummies, specifically Egyptian ones, had blackened skin, which many believe to have been caused by the use of something called bitumen during the mummification process. All right, so what is bitumen? Bitumen is a type of mineral pitch that occurs naturally in the Middle East and Southeastern Europe. It can also be artificially created through the burning of coal or wood, but classical scholars tell us that bitumen had medicinal properties. If mixed with wine, milk, oil, vinegar, herbs, bitumen could help cure coughs, shortness of breath, dysentery, rheumatoid pain, and a host of various other issues. If it's mixed with flour, it became a paste which could heal wounds. Because of this, bitumen was highly prized and in constant demand, so much so that to make supplies last longer, merchants actually cut pure bitumen with pitch. So once again, here's this question: how do we go from the medicinal use of bitumen into grinding up mummies into powder? So classical writers tell us that bitumen was exported to Egypt, where it was mixed with herbs and used in the embalming process. Today, research has sort of debunked this. We know that during the first 2,000 years or so of mummification practices, it was resin that was used to create that dark sheen and luster of the mummified skin. Bitumen wasn't used until the New Kingdom substantially later. Regardless, the term for the material became the term for the embalmed bodies of the Egyptian dead. Mumia is literally a Persian Arabic word that means wax, tar, or bitumen. As time progressed, bitumen as a drug, which started to be referred to simply as mumia, continued to be prescribed or discussed as a treatment by various physicians and philosophers. While studies of the ancient writers continued, new texts were constantly being imported to Europe. One of the earliest and arguably the most influential in the rise of Western medicine was the writings of a man named Avicenna. Avicenna was an 11th century Islamic philosopher and physician who wrote a document called Canon, which for 500 years was the basis of medical training in Europe. In Canon, he states that when mixed with herbs or other liquids like oil, butter, milk, or wine, mumia is efficacious in the treatments of everything from abscesses, which probably would have helped Ippy, fractures, concussions, paralysis, all the way to digestive and lymphatic problems, afflictions of throat, heart, and lungs. Mumia became a staple in apothecary shops, but an interesting transmutation was already starting to take place. People began to forget that the medicinal value of mumia was in the bitumen itself, rather than in the mummified body. As more and more Arabic medicinal texts were imported to Europe, their translations led to misinterpretation, so much so that people began believing bitumen was only efficacious when taken from a body that had been treated with it. An example of this comes from Gerard of Cremona, who defined the word mummy as, quote, the substance found in the land where bodies are buried with aloes, by which the liquid of the dead, mixed with the aloes, is transformed and is similar to marine pitch. By the 12th century, there was a strong market in the supply of mummia, which began to be referred to as simply mummy. The market for mummy, which was created specifically from breaking up bodies of Egyptian mummies, was centered in Alexandria, Egypt itself. Tomb raiding was a successful and lucrative trade and had been for decades and even centuries by that point. But it wasn't this time for just the gold and semi-precious stones and other antiquities that could be found, but because of the medicinal uses of the bodies themselves. As demand for bitumen increased, supplies decreased. The Egyptian government began prohibiting traffic in mummies. In response, as you can imagine, there was a large black market that began to form. The bodies on this black market, however, were not always authentic mummies. Merchants went so far as to find bodies, stuff them with bitumen, wrap them and dry them in the sun in order to find financial gain. So people who were buying these bodies thought they were getting, Imhotep, the high priest of Luxor, but really they were getting Bob the camel driver. It was a problem. So by the 15 and 1600s, some writers, scholars, and physicians began condemning the use of mummia, partly because of this. But there were multiple other reasons. But people selling it or using it were completely ignorant of the origins of the drug itself. Surgeons and doctors continued to prescribe it regardless. But eventually, mummy lost its connection with humans and just came to mean flesh that had been treated or medicated with bitumen. Recipes start abounding where you can make new sources of mummy by using the carcasses of birds. And although there are references to mummia in German catalogs as late as the early 20th century, the drug had started largely falling out of favor by the 1700s. Regardless, it's one of the staples of a discipline called corpse medicine, whereby you use corpses and people that suffered from the same ailment as you to help relieve your own symptoms. That gets very dark and foreboding, so I think I'll just wait until anybody has any questions about that. And in the meantime, I'll end my talk with this. I know history continues to be made on social, political, economic, and ideological fronts every day, every second, every moment. But as Frank Herbert, the author of Dune, said, there's no real ending, just the place where you stop the story. And I've reached the end of mine. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Daryn. That was fascinating. Wow. That's a lot to sort of take in. So I'm going to open the floor up to questions if anyone wants to raise their hand. We did get quite a few in our registration, and I can lead off with one or two, but I wanted the folks in the audience to be able to ask their questions as well. So I'll give you one from here, and then we'll move on. Who designed the Barnum Museum? Who was the actual space?
This is quite a funny point. So it was initially designed by Lambert and Bonnell, which I had said, but ultimately 10 days after making that announcement, Barnum decided to sign a contract with Longstaff and Hurd. Hurd was a relative of his through one of his daughter's marriages, and they were actually responsible for designing a couple of his houses in Bridgeport. Their design is not drastically different from the one Lambert and Bonnell had placed forward and that had been initially approved. But yeah, it ultimately was Longstaff and Hurd.
All right. Does anyone have anything that they want to bring up? Any questions for Daryn?
Or if not, I'm happy to answer some of the other ones that might have come through.
Yep. I'm going to move on. So what kind of cryptids do you have at the museum? This is a fun one.
All right, so we have two mermaids. One is fake, one is real. We we have a centaur. And I think in terms of cryptids, those are the only ones we have. But if anybody sees a chupacabra come up for auction, I definitely am interested. So send me that.
And then how are your artifacts preserved? So it's a broad question. I know it's a tough one since you have so many different types, but
Yeah, so there's various different ways that we address the preservation and conservation of our artifacts. I mean, you can't see it, but in the room I'm in, I'm surrounded by paintings, all of which have Tyvek covers to lower the light levels that they're exposed to on a constant basis. When it comes to textiles or other materials like that are laying flat in boxes, we used inert materials, anything from cotton batting to muslin to buffered or unbuffered tissue paper, depending on what it is. We have forms that sometimes we stuff things with to make sure that the shape is not lost. We use a lot of polyethylene foam. I'm trying to think with our documents and stuff, depending on what they are, they're usually in an acid-free container of some sort. Our remains, our physical remains, we no longer have any ethnographic materials associated with physical remains of Native peoples, indigenous populations here, but we do have the mummy. She has her own crate, and she has a little, you can see it here. It's my humidifier, my humidity tracker. So she definitely is crated and packaged very nicely. Her head is separate from her body, so it's perpendicular to her body because the neck was broken at some point in the past. And the mermaid currently lives in a box with a sheet over it, so she doesn't escape.
all right. So what is the donation source for many of your archival material, your archives, your objects?
Once again, we have various donors who give us stuff. Anybody, we do have things that were passed down through the Barnum family. One of our long-term board members is the great granddaughter of P.T. Barnum. Things have certainly come in through either her or other relatives of P.T. Barnum. Some were donated by Nancy Fish Barnum, Barnum's second wife, upon his death or shortly thereafter. People are constantly calling us, and one of the great ones was somebody found a box in their attic marked Tom Thumb's wedding cake. And so we have a piece of Tom Thumb's wedding cake that was found in the attic. But people are constantly reaching out to us, asking us if we want to donate things, either circus related items, which is always kind of a nuanced thing for us. We don't accept a whole ton of those. But there have been instances where other museums are deaccessioning parts of their collections because they're not relevant to their collections policy. Excuse me. So we do get some.
Oh, you okay? Take your time. So as Daryn recovers, I'm gonna tee up another question for her as she'll be back soon. But do you have a relationship? Does the Barnum have a relationship with the museum in Florida at all? Or is there any kind of, there is in Sarasota?
Yes. So they're much more focused on Ringling specifically.
Mm-hmm.
And they have a wider collections policy than us. So they focus a lot on the 20th century side of things.
Mm-hmm.
And we focus on 18th century to we have a couple of things that go beyond 1800, but
and you mentioned, Daryn, the fire a couple times. I don't think that's common knowledge. Can you describe what that was?
So Barnum had numerous problems with his fires. over the course of his life. So one of his houses burned in Afghanistan. It was built in 1854 and I think burnt 4 days later because a workman left a lit cigarette or lit cigar on a couch. So that burnt. Both of his museums, his museum burnt twice. So once in 1865 and once in 1868. So after the second burning, he decided, this is it. I can't rebuild this again. So he decided to retire. He was bored within a year and started the greatest show on earth.
Interesting. I didn't know Iranistan only survived 4 days after it was
4 years. It was a
oh,
couple
4
years.
years.
It wasn't long. And I don't think the family lived there for any great amount of time either. And the thing that I find most interesting, particularly about the fires in New York, is that a few years before this, there was the Great Fire of New York, which took out a huge amount of area right around Barnum's Museum. And as a result, they put in the Croton aqueducts to try to help fight fires. The second time the museum burnt, that aqueduct was of no help whatsoever. So there was no way to put out that fire, but there are these amazing photographs where you just see it frozen from all the water that was being pumped into it on a consistent basis to try to put that fire out.
Anyone have any other questions from the audience?
Can we just ask?
Sure.
Oh, hi, Elizabeth Boyce, Easton Historical Society. It was a wonderful lecture. Thank you. Easton, the source of water for anything that was going on down in Bridgeport. Can you give us some idea about how Fairfield Historical Society, Fairfield County Historical Society, how you're studying that collection as opposed to just the Barnum collection?
So the beginnings of our collection really come from those 3 historical societies. So the Barnum Institute for Science and History opened in 1893 with specific spaces relegated to each of those 3 societies. The first floor was supposed to be retail space that would then, the income from that would generate enough to maintain the building. So the onus wasn't on any 3 of those societies. We don't have tons from the Fairfield County Historical Society in our collection, but we do have a number of very early artifacts that came in through those societies. So Ippy, the mummy, is one. We obviously just did a huge study on her. I'm systematically embarking on research of various other early donations through those societies. So I don't know if you've looked at our YouTube. I do a series called Curious People Wanted, where I look at the history of some of the artifacts in our collection, some of which I just presented to you. But we have everything from Roman oil lamps, and I've looked at those, to we have these amazing aquamarine glass chains, which are glass whimsies, which have a really cool history. We have a pufferfish lantern from Japan, and then we have a bunch of headhunter ethnographic materials from supposedly from the Jivaro peoples of Ecuador. While they're not, I don't think they're Jivaro. I think that they're just tourist implements. I have been trying to systematically kind of tackle each of these things in turn to sort of piece together more of the background and backstory to some of these early objects, because while one of the earliest curators, David Pell Secor, took some degree of notes, we don't really know the full provenance. And a lot of these things were brought back through tourism and tourist activities. So some of these I have done videos on, and then I would invite you to actually to watch them, because I really go into a lot of detail. The glass whimsy one I thought was particularly fun. But yeah, so as I'm identifying them and reassigning those early accession numbers back to them, because some of them were separated from them, I definitely go through the process of looking at where they came from, looking through the historical society records and kind of reconstructing the history surrounding them so that nothing is just hanging in our database saying there's this sword from this place. You know, I like seeing the full. I don't know if that answers your question.
No, it does. Thank you very much. I've done a bit of work about Roland Lacey and the Fairfield County Historical Society, and I know you have a great listing of objects there in their archives, but the objects aren't there. So I hope they're found somewhere on a shelf somewhere.
I certainly hope so. I haven't found them yet, but when I do find things, it's there's also some really early ones. We have a rock that I particularly like. It's a rock, and in pencil it says, and I think it's a Fairfield County Historical Society thing. It says rock taken from the river where David slew Goliath. And it's like that I'm always really intrigued by, because like, how did this story get pushed to this rock, and why is it written in pencil, and is there no other documentation?
Thank you so much.
Absolutely.
And then one last question from, if anyone has anything else in the audience, please let me know. But if not, I'm going to ask, it's kind of a statement, but it came from Jim Bowen, and he said that, does the museum recognize the genius of Mr. Barnum in being instrumental in so many extraordinary institutions in Bridgeport, like the hospital and Bridgeport Public Library and the water company? Each of those things that he says is all considered ahead of their time. So do you recognize that in the museum itself? Do you interpret any of that?
We are planning to, certainly, when we go through the reinterpretation process. Yes, in short, we do recognize that, and we maintain very close relationships with those groups. We talk to the hospital all the time. The library I work with very closely because they have a P.T. Barnum archive themselves. We have a digital version of that archive online that we mutually kind of deal with and curate. We also recognize that Barnum was an entertainment revolutionary in a lot of ways. He was the one who brought opera to America. He was the one who displayed the first aquarium in 1854 in the basement of his American Museum. It was the first aquarium established in America. So we have a very close relationship with the Norwalk Maritime Aquarium. But also in that, we do recognize that he is a product of his time. And there are some stories that, as great as he was and as wonderful he was with the development and the importation of industry to Bridgeport and the establishment of these very good and very important institutions, that there are difficult stories that we are going to have to embrace. Whether it be racism, exploitation, the use of or the display of people with medical conditions, all of that is something that we are going to have to talk about during our reimagination as well.
Well, if nobody has anything else, I want to thank you again for all of this really interesting, fascinating information today. I'm sure we're all looking forward to getting to the Barnum when it's open again. And thanks to everyone for joining us. Please join us if you can on Saturday. We would love to see you in Wilton. And thanks for everyone. Thank you. Have a good one.